Anyway, so why don't we get started at least a little bit. There were about 16 people joining this, so I'll stall a little bit more. But the piece that we're going to dig into today is looking at FinTech, which I think is Sierra spot on for what you're working on. And thinking a little bit of just getting grounded in financial technologies. So I'm just wondering, we can maybe talk about this versus drop it in the chat, but do you have a financial technology that you rely on? Like, how do financial technologies actually show up in our world? I don't know. What's your...
I think a lot about banking apps like Venmo, Cash App. I just think it makes things easier, and that's what I think of with financial technology.
Yep.
PayPal and crypto. Yep.
PayPal. Some of these have become pretty ubiquitous. Clea, how much lens in your world do you have into FinTech? Is it something?
I mean, last week I had a meeting with two different companies who are in the Decentralized Identity Foundation and have feet in the blockchain crypto world, talking about spinning up a working group on FinTech in the Decentralized Identity Foundation. But I'm still sort of, I understand beyond like helping us move money around, what do they do, right? And that's where I kind of get like, I don't get, like, why is everybody buzzy about FinTech? It's just like electronic banks or like weird crypto money. Like,
Cool. Absolutely. I feel the similar way as I look at all of these accelerators saying we're going to accelerate FinTech. How about you, Dora? Does FinTech show up in your world?
Yeah, it doesn't really, except for the sort of functional basic tools that have already come up, QuickBooks and, straightforward banking tools. We're operating still a little bit more old school. And I have a little bit of the same attitude, we've done a little bit of exploration, for example, of robo-advisors, which don't seem to be all that successful for the most part. And so I'm not entirely yet sure what the cachet is for FinTech.
Yep.
Either.
When I was looking at stuff just on FinTech and gender equality earlier today, just to kind of figure out, is there a quick link? One of the first things that I did, sort of impact investing and FinTech, and one of the first things that popped up was just that we will have new ways for people to invest their wealth through these online apps. And I will say my kid does it. So
but
she has an app on her phone, puts in a certain amount of money, buys stock, moves around at 21. This is how she manages her socially responsible investing.
My sense is of those is there are a couple of things. One is I'm not aware of any that is actually financially viable on that business. The ones that are financially viable, that's not where they're making their money. On the ESG exclusively ESG ones, so I think there are some that are making money. Robinhood, I think, is profitable, but people grow out of them because they don't offer. Most people don't know that much about investing and don't want to learn that much about investing, and after a little while you need more after a certain point you need more structure or more guidance, and so either you're going to move into more of a fund platform, or you're going to need a financial advisor, and then you're back. You may have an interface. I mean, whether you're Schwab or Merrill Lynch or someplace else where you have an advisor who helps you choose what to invest in, you may still do a lot of transactional stuff through an online interface, but it's not really tech mediated. So there's still a lot of human touch going on there, and I think people want that as they get beyond a certain point. That's at least so far my sense. We talk a lot about the wealth transition to the millennial generation, and what we see is that they still want human touch, hand holding, to manage that money.
Vicki, what are you seeing? Where you encounter fintech?
So my background is traditional domestic banking, so I've seen it from that point of view as a disruption, I suppose. But one thing that's interesting is our regulator here in Australia, ASIC, has actually set up what they call a sandbox, where they're actually providing a lot of resources to fintechs to actually try and cut through some of traditional regulation to actually accelerate development of especially blockchain. So blockchain, so what the conversations I've had in thinking about accessibility for retail investors and tapping into the use of the client interface, where people do actually want that technology and the information. Blockchain can provide that, so much data that is, rather than being held by the institutions, it's actually far more accessible to the consumer. And so I see consumer-led technology as being attractive.
What you, Rosanna?
A couple of things. I mean, yeah, similar to what everyone's been saying, and Keenly was looking at, I think the social impact investing, consumer, apps and things like that. Girlfriend of mine is doing a startup called Vested in the UK predominantly, that started off thinking it might be directly to B2C, and essentially aggregating impact data, but much more sort of on the ground, what has actually the outcomes that we're looking for, and how to company, particularly like might be like bonds or like different opportunities, as well as listed organizations, truly impact like further down the chain in terms of impact. So it's a data play, but they're having some good conversations over there. So I guess that's sort of fintech. And then two other friends in Australia, one runs a company called Valiant, and they do there's sort of a platform as well for loans, and have really grown over the last few years. And then another one called Equitize, which is like crowdfunding IPOs and wholesale offers in the market as well. And I think the other one, which I probably can't say too much about, another friend, again, it's blockchain, but it's looking at how globally, reducing the cost of money transfers through the use of blockchain, and also some other things around. Anyway, but I think there's this common theme around a couple of those later ones of how do we provide options, and also how do we lower costs, particularly for the transfer of money, particularly in like parts of Asia as well, where you'll have a lot of people living overseas and sending money home, and it being like quite high transfer fees as well. And so how do you make accessibility have more people accessible to the opportunity to have financial control, as well as, how do we create visibility of what impact, and using a tech solution to really drive the data capture and transparency around that. So those are a few in my world.
Cool. Yeah, and I mean, it's just interesting to think of like, what is this area of innovation and how prolific it is in generating new entrepreneurial activity. It's really quite stunning. So I think the marrying of how much, how many of us know entrepreneurs, which is pretty privileged position to sit in general, but like know people who are thinking about how do we do fintech because it's so hot, right? It's such a thing, particularly even in impact investing. Carolyn, how about you?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of experiences. Much like your daughter, actively buying, selling shares in either individual companies or mutual funds or electronic platform, and using a socially responsible screen to kind of look into, where does it meet my impact targets, and tracking that both financial and impact on the interface. So love it because it's easy to use on my phone, access it anytime I need. But then professionally, I've also seen two applications of fintech that we haven't talked about. So I'm going to throw these into the group. So one is the mobile money. So I've seen people be paid through electronic currency, and that's been widely successful in financial inclusion efforts, getting people access to a currency that they can then, use to pay for their goods. And it provides especially women like access to control over their financial resources that they may not have had before, as well as some stability and sensing, okay, I have this amount in my bank account, and there's a financial security component associated with that as well. The other application I've seen is with an electronic smart subsidy. So that just means that my company had decided that, various inputs, whether it be farming technologies or access to certain technical providers that could do coaching, we would discount the price of those items and give it access to people that couldn't otherwise afford the full price. And they were given a special code that was sent to their mobile device. They went onto a website, inserted that code, and were able to then gain access to the platform or to the actual physical device. And I think that was widely successful again, in including a population that otherwise wouldn't have been able to access those goods or services, as well as being able to go deeper into the rural areas where we personally couldn't go ourselves, but we could then ensure that the training got delivered. And especially in conflict-prone areas, that was extremely helpful. Otherwise, they may not have had access to those good services. And because they were able to get it at a discounted price, they were kind of the early adopters in their community. And I think there was a lot of socialization that went, behind the scenes. And therefore, when we increased the price to the full market potential, we actually saw a higher uptake in the sales of those goods and services. So the easy adoption rate that was provided by the mobile exchange, I think, led to a wider adoption overall.
Versus a devaluing of the good and saying, this is supposed to always be cheaper.
Yeah, exactly. We're not devaluing the good. We're not devaluing the price of the item. It's a special discount for a limited time offer. Early adopters get in and are rewarded for taking that risk. As many of them were the first in their community to participate in this type of program.
Oh, cool. Cool. That was Meta, or was that?
That was Meta, but I've seen Mobile Money work in another organization that I've been part of.
Yeah. Very cool. So why don't we transition from, that's the general world of financial technologies, which we can figure out. Sarah, did you roll in? Yeah, you talked about the sort of exchanging money. We can keep coming back to this. So anyway, before we dive further, because we're now going to make a transition between this relatively innocuous world of mobile money and what that has to do with gender-based violence. So hands off computers for a second, off your keyboard, and because it stays hard to talk about gender-based violence. So hold your own hand. We're not alone. We have power in our hands. This is not a light topic. And in this conversation, we will intellectualize and abstract a set of very real experiences. These discussions may trigger a wide range of emotions. In this room, statistically, are many survivors of gender-based violence. And we all participate in political, social, cultural, and economic systems that give permission for and facilitate violence. Financial abuse is behavior that seeks to control a person's ability to acquire, use, or maintain economic resources, and threatens their self-sufficiency and financial autonomy. Financial abuse occurs in 99% of domestic violence cases. A moment of silence to acknowledge the violence happening in this precise moment, somewhere, to someone. Now reverse your hands. Notice the difference. We've come together to create possibilities to address the epidemic of violence in our world, and connected in new ways, we can do even more. So let's begin. So I think we've had an ongoing conversation about fintech for a while, and the sort of connection between fintech and gender-based violence. And from an investment perspective, translating this for you, Sierra, just for a second, from a financial perspective, lots of the problems that people experience are in financial services. And this goes to your point, Vicki. The problems are in financial services, but the financial services aren't invested in, right? They're managed within a complex business, but fintech takes in investment capital. So if we wanted to be able to influence financial services, fintech becomes a way to influence that. In this sort of massive financial services world that in general doesn't do a great job of providing services to survivors or recognizing questions of the financial abuse that happens in the world. Over years and years ago, maybe 15 years ago, AARP, what's AARP? Retired Persons, American Association of Retired Persons, largest membership organization in the world. But anyway, AARP, we were working with them as they were launching this kind of new banking effort and looking specifically at elder abuse. That just this sort of, all these things that are happening within financial services that either accelerate or add to the abuse, which I'm guessing, Sierra, you know a ton about. But from an investment perspective, fintech seemed like a way that if we could influence those innovations, then we could influence financial services. And in the impact investing world, at least, there was a kind of broad swath of the kind of promise of fintech. And y'all talked about a bunch of these, but you know, MasterCard Foundation is leading a chunk of this, but they're telling a story that fintech is a path to women's economic empowerment, right? That by giving access to mobile money, MasterCard actually had a significant statement that a cashless economy would contribute to gender equality. Because a lot of the corruption and fraud and sort of could be handled through the data transparency of things online, and you could see things more clearly. But also the access to participate in the system, reducing the cost of transactions, giving people access to more services than they would have has been a lot of it. So that's a kind of at the banking, sort of banking services level and moving money around and where does my money sit. I also think there's been less focus on gender at the end that Dora, you were talking about in terms of being able to be wealth advisors. They get a younger population maybe jumping on board, like Carolyn and my daughter, and 25 million other people who are thinking in a similar way. So there is a market for that. But so sort of both at the lower level transactions and at the, you know, investment side and everything in begin, it sort of had this promise of women's economic empowerment. And so that was intriguing to us, of somebody saying, we think we're accomplishing women's economic empowerment by shifting our banking practices. And could we shine a light on that to say, are you actually making a difference? Because most of the fintech innovations that we've looked at don't actually have a clue about gender. I've not looked at it in any way, shape, or form, but it falls into the general swath of giving access to financial services for women who might not have as easy access to these services by reducing the costs. So I'll just play that out as an argument. Yeah.
I'm going to jump in here. I have seen this exactly take place in a variety of emerging markets. I'm going to call it Myanmar in particular, that, you know, there's such a digital divide and women don't have access to mobile technology. And if they do, it's part of a shared resource in their household. So whether or not they have, you know, signed up for a mobile banking scheme or a micro insurance product that's delivered electronically, they are not in control of being able to use that to its full potential. And it's a real problem. And I think, if anything, it's almost exacerbating, you know, financial inequalities as well as gender inequalities.
I would also, I would add to that here, even here in the US, most of those technologies are still tied to bank access and they don't serve the unbanked. So things like PayPal and Venmo don't do you any good if you use Zelle if you don't have a bank account, because ultimately you have to be able to get the money off the app and into the real and into the non-app world, and you can only do that through your bank. You can only set up one of these accounts by tying it to your bank account. If you don't have a bank account, you're out of luck. And you're,
or if you have a bank account but you don't have control of your bank
or
account.
you have a banking, or if you have a bank account but your husband or somebody else has control of the bank account, you don't have control of the money. So so we still need to get over the hump of how to serve the unbanked.
Right. Do you see this in your worlds here? Like the flip side. So here's the hype of fintech. I think there's I don't know if there's something to the hype. A lot of money is moving in this direction to say we're solving and getting women access to blah, blah, blah. But Sierra?
Now, you just made me think of a good point, and especially you, Carolyn, when you were talking about like reaching populations that don't necessarily have access to these like different types of bank tech, financial technology. So I spent a summer in Lesotho last summer, and which is a small country in South Africa. And so a lot of the things that people did use were things like Forex and other trading apps, because that was a way that it could give them access to money that they wouldn't normally have access to. And I found that that's what actually like raised people's financial status more than anything else. I don't want to speak too much since I'm not familiar about the whole process, but I would say that is one thing I noticed. And so that's one thing that I think could carry over into economic justice for survivors, because we do a lot of microloan programs. And so that just made me kind of connect the two dots.
Gotcha. And I mean, I think there is some, so now making sort of this connection, because the challenge is, here's this innovation happening around fintech, and how that plays out with gender broadly and women's access is a mixed bag, right? There's a lot of people studying to what extent does increased access, there's a lot of studies also of what does increased access to debt cause as unintended consequences, right? Because a lot of these are providing access only to debt, at which point you click your way into more debt than you've necessarily calculated. But bringing it back specifically to how this applies to gender-based violence is sort of questions of who's in control of the technology, and does this give the survivor more or less control, either to get out of the situation or once they're out to stay safe. giving that sort of financial security. C-Note, do you guys know C-Note? It's a great company out of California. So the letter C and then Note is actually been specifically working on a product that is anonymous bank accounts that lets them hold them for emergency situations. So you can be in a marriage and hold a anonymous bank account. And so that you can, the details of how it all works is past me, but she's genius. But basically building assets for emergency situations that your spouse can't get access to. And that kind of, I know NAB's been doing some of this stuff, Vicki, in Australia. How much did they do as part of that banking process?
The main thing that they were focusing on was the microfinance, or so Good Shepherd money and access to, so I suppose trying to disrupt the payday lenders so that there was no, the cost. So not putting a prohibitive cost on access to finance just for things like household goods. So if you were fleeing the house, you were able to, get a fridge and, do all those type of things. So yeah, and then Speckle was the second iteration of that.
And so, but wasn't, when they did the NAB assist thing around domestic violence, wasn't part of that also making sure that their banking was private? Was there something around that, or am I just making that up?
I don't know if you're making it. I was thinking about it as you were saying it, because I was thinking more about the, anti-money laundering and the requirement for, our AUSTRAC requirements of who, the ownership of money and movement of money. So I'll look into that, because I think that, NAB Assist did have and does have some really good programs, but I don't know how they would segregate it from, I'd say it would be segregated from technology, but it would still be identified. And probably, for example, how would information be disseminated, like with things like not going to the home address or things like that. I'll get an update, Joy.
Oh, that'd be cool. So I think part of it, Joy, did you want to throw in, or? Okay. So the place that I'm going with this, and we can see the place that we've been thinking through, and just as an outline of, we're sort of in these design conversations, right? So here's the problem, right? Problem is we have a lot of money moving to fintech, like a lot of money, right? Back to, I don't know, Kalia, if you can, I don't know if you can convey the extent of the hype around this in a useful way, but I do find it relatively mind-boggling some days.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about how, like, you're like, oh, it's big now. I'm like, when, like, I've been hearing about it for a long time. There's this conference money 2020. Is it particularly extra big now, or like, I'm confused? No, it's just.
No, I think it's been growing over the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
So but I don't think it's, I mean, that from over the last 10 years, it's gotten to be more active.
But I mean, who are they giving the money to? It's just the same old tech bros, right? So then you have all the gender investment issues that are, everybody's been surfacing about Silicon Valley, which are atrociously large.
Fair enough. And it is those. I was looking, Caroline, I think I dropped this into a link. I actually found, so the question for me is, how would we influence it, right? Because this is tech bro world, right? This is tech bro world that in impact investing is putting a women's economic empowerment wash on it, right? The number of sort of tech access innovations that say one of the things that we accomplish is providing access for women is pretty broad, right? And financial services and women is a huge portion of the market, right? Women as financial services consumers are huge. So most financial technologies, in theory, On the consumer side, should be designed for women. Whether or not they are is up for grabs. Oh, here it is. This. So I was actually looking at. So I was part of the beginning of this organization, and they're supposed to be good at gender. So Village Capital has done a few fintech. So I don't mean to be snarky. I do think Village Capital has deeply tried to be good at gender. But this is a classic example of 12 fintech startups. All these were just Latin America alone. But so Village Capital is a US based but global accelerator, right? Let's get a bunch of businesses together, have them learn from each other and grow their businesses and be better, but particularly to grow their impact, right? Only companies that are trying to have a positive social impact. And so MetLife has been behind a bunch of these for a few years now. These actually started even before I was on the board of Village Capital and before I left. And so if you go through these, as I was just looking at, one, I don't know, how come tech names are always so weird? Facts still, like, couldn't they just say real words or say more than one word? No, can't do that. Anyway, in looking through these, right, these are exactly what we've just been talking about. How do we do something that increases access by using financial technology that ease a pathway? So I'll just name Village Capital as an example. They are actively trying to be better at gender. They have, I would guarantee, no gender lens on these companies. So the question is, how could we not just directly move capital, but part of the strategies that we've been thinking about is how do we take places of impact investing, places where people are trying to do good things, and figure out how to bring in a gender-based violence lens to say, most of these, not all of them, but most of these would be adjacent to experience of gender-based violence, right? Not all of them, right? But if you look through this list, a lot of them are right next door to it. So how could we affect how Village Capital is influencing these companies? And that's the proposition that we've been thinking through.
So I'm thinking back to probably the first Convergence that I came to, and I remember asking essentially the same question about
15 years
gender in general, and thinking, the first step, we're talking about the first step being simply to ask questions, to articulate questions about that issue in the evaluation process, whether it's for companies we're letting into our accelerator program or companies we're investing in, but to ask them to articulate how they are addressing the issue. Because most of them, I guarantee, have never said a word about the issue of gender-based violence. They haven't thought about it. It's never occurred to them to think about fintech and its relationship to gender-based violence in any capacity, and just asking the question, asking them to articulate a strategy or articulate a relationship, even before they get to articulating a strategy, articulating a relationship between their work and gender-based violence, so that they're even thinking about the fact that there is a connection or a relationship, right? Because they're not doing that today. Nobody's doing that today except those of us that thought to join this conference, right? I bet we make up a very sizable majority of all the people in the world that are thinking about this issue.
But at some point, you do have lots and lots of accelerators within impact investing, just to take that as an example, because it feels tangible, like a thing you could try to influence, right? There are all these accelerators happening all over the world where people are supporting new companies and they connect them with investors. And most of those accelerators in the impact space, at least, are checking whether or not they're women-led ventures, right? they are, you know, what part of what you were working at in Agora was to figure out how do we get more women-led businesses into it. The reality is putting women-led businesses in does not guarantee you a gender lens, right? And nobody was really having conversations about the impact people were having. They would bring me in to talk to the accelerators and send me off with the women and say, have them feel better about their experience in this accelerator. And then you guys will all come back and then we'll continue to talk about the same things. I did eventually, Kalia just stopped going. Because every time I said, I won't come, I swear I will not come if you are not offering a session on gender for everybody, not having me provide moral support for the women. And they were so tricky about what they promised me, and then I'd show up and one more time meet with the women to see if they felt okay about the experience.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's so good to talk to another woman.
I mean, the fact that there isn't basic capacity to talk about gender, and I'll add like, and race, and like, you know, there's a whole bunch of stuff that just is sort of off, like, nobody's developed their muscles to talk about them amongst, you know, white men who have lots of power and influence in places like Silicon Valley.
Right.
So, well, and it goes to the top of it, right? So you end up, you know, Peter Thiel is like, you know, written books about being anti-diversity, and Andreessen Horowitz, the Horowitz in Andreessen Horowitz is the son of David Horowitz.
I so didn't know that.
Well, they make sure to keep it out of Wikipedia, but it's true.
Gotcha. I just love Silicon Valley. And so they're just, it's a wonderful place. And so the question is, what would enable us to, there is investment capital moving. So part of it is thinking about a couple layers of influence, right? Like, we work in finance, right? So the ability to launch a new company that's going to transform everything is not what we're going to think about, although really glad your friends are doing that, and hopefully they're thinking about gender. Maybe you can go ask them, right? The second piece is what we can influence are the people who are financing that. And there is a set of people in Silicon Valley who are gender lens investors working in fintech, who also, it didn't occur to them that there would be a gender lens in fintech. They are gender lens investors who don't think about gender in fintech. So we were starting to, okay, Kalia, full on exhausting. So
it's their job, isn't it, Joy?
Yeah, I choose all the really exhausting things. That's what we all do, right? So we were trying to organize them and say, what questions are you asking in your due diligence, right? So what are the sets of things, and this is partly where the bridge to your world, Sierra, becomes really important, of like, what should we be asking for? What are the things that would have a negative impact, right? We had a whole conversation with USAID about, because they work on all of this stuff, but don't connect it to investing, right? They're like funding little apps, and, you know, Bcash is God's gift to the future of blah, 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 but the gender folks aren't in that. Anyway, so figuring out how do we connect these things together and say, one, how could you shape due diligence in how investors are looking at it? Two, could we shape how we're stimulating innovation? And could we come out with, this is sort of the thinking about metrics that would say, are they addressing this, right? Not do you intend to affect women and girls, but what are you changing in how you invest in such a way that you're more likely to have better outcomes from your fintech technologies? Rosanna, what are you thinking?
I am really sorry. I just was having a phone call come through, so now I feel like it's the worst time for you to ask me as I was like distracted.
Oh, but you just went on mute instead of.
Oh, sorry. So can you just repeat? Sorry, I just feel like I missed some of what you were saying, and I have been.
No, it's fine. I'll let you catch back up again.
I'm so sorry.
Don't worry about it.
So in terms of shaping due diligence, it's about the types of data you're collecting. So are you thinking through the investment from the value or the perspective of, you know, the consumer who will use that product or service, the people who are involved in manufacturing it or selling it, or purchasing it. All of those pieces, like, that needs to come out in the due diligence, because often you'll realize that, you know, we were producing this product or service for one group and it actually is being used by a totally different segment of the population for this totally different reason that we hadn't even considered. And that's a business model transformation. Or we thought that, you know, our supply chain was totally clean, our manufacturers are doing a really great job, but we don't actually realize that the marketers are, you know, involved in these negative practices. And that's something that we need to be aware of, because that's a market risk.
Yeah.
Considered.
Yeah, Rosanna?
Sorry, I was jumping in.
Oh, yeah, go for it. Go if you want to.
No, I think it's interesting to, just another angle on that came up the other day when some work around getting more dads involved in care, and we were chatting to a formula. This is something different from my MCC work, but chatting to a formula company about opportunities there, and actually I'll get to like the fintech and the gender equality, gender-based violence, but I think for them, you know, their core market is women, right? And their whole marketing strategy and the way in which they're looking at driving their organization forward is a certain type of customer. And actually there's, you know, a real upside for them if they started to think about the way in which both that they can drive that change to really target men in that conversation around formula, but also if the market's going to go that way, like, how do they jump on that first, right? And I think with maybe with gender lens as well, like a way that might ignite and get people thinking differently through that due diligence process too is, all right, but also like you might have all these men as well that contribute to an environment which is safe for everyone, and yet we know the statistics around gender-based violence. So I guess that's just like another lens that might not be talked about a lot, is not just how do we support women, but how do we, particularly if this might fit into their wider mission as just sort of like supporting all and creating safe and good environments and communities, is how do we help men as well be more aware of their role that they can play to stop gender-based violence and support gender equality. And that might also be like a lens through due diligence. They say, well, what is the opportunity here for men? I realize that that's not necessarily always going to be something that they focus on in terms of the increase in profit, but there's just like another lens I think that would be really interesting for organizations to think through at that early stage, just to say like, what do you want to be as an organization? How are you thinking about that?
Totally. Who have you tested your products and services on? Because often like they'll have done a very small segment of the population in their test group and think that that's their consumer base. And it's not, that they actually, you know, through having a more diverse, inclusive test market, you realize that you can actually be selling to more people than you thought in ways you hadn't considered before. And that just really opens up your market potential and ability to scale.
So influencing investors, getting them to ask different questions, influencing accelerators, and then a third piece of actually figuring out how tangible can we be, and how do we actually have survivors informing all of these questions, and we're not just intellectually thinking about what might be useful, and how does that happen?
I just listening to Carolyn talk then, and about the change in market, or the change in usage of the product, and the away, or as far as our questioning, or what is raised in incubator stage, is the question of what happens if your technology is used for evil, you know, like just, I suppose, a way of framing that, so that in that DD process there is a you know, in amongst the hype of how scalable is this, and where is next seed investment coming from, and so forth, what happens if it becomes something that is damaging? And I'm not sure that gets raised.
Right.
That's
love
just
that.
more a comment. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I work with a colleague, Shireen Mitchell, we started a project called Human First Tech. And one of the things that we're trying to do is there's a thing in the tech world called threat modeling. It's usually done around like security things with a pure, so it's just really focused on the technical aspects of that, but we're trying to shift the frame and add like social threat modeling is really key. And it seems like these kind of like understanding, which is more like, you know, looking at like, it's very obvious to the American women, people in tech, that face could be used for evil. It's just that the people designing it didn't think about it because they didn't do good threat modeling, right? So if we're talking about financial products, like, is there a threat modeling kind of framework around gender-based violence that could be created to support those app builders thinking through use cases that their women users might face?
I think that term social threat modeling, which I haven't heard before, that's have anyone else had that before?
No, but I'm just writing down a lot of stuff because for me, that's the insight coming out of this conversation. I don't know about the 7 of you, but I wasn't sure where this was going exactly, but Leah just went, booyah.
No, that's brilliant. Like nobody ever.
Sorry, go ahead. You go.
No one ever asks about the negative implications. Like it's always, you know, growth is a positive thing, greater uptake is a positive thing. You know, this specific use case that you think is going to happen is a positive thing. But what have you thought of that you haven't thought of? What do you not know about your own business?
And I even take it back to, you know, the very beginning of just mobile phone technology, whereby now, you know, the greatest risk or the greatest thing that is seen when a woman presents to, or that when they've fled the situation, I think the statistic is something like 90% have got a tracking device in their mobile, which the technology has been used to track their movement. So to me, that is an unintended consequence of that technology, which has been used for perpetrators. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And the surveillance technology, home safety issues are off the charts. I think this is kind of, but I think specifically, sorry, Rosanna, were you going to jump in?
Oh, no, but go for it and I'll jump in after.
I don't know. The thing that I'm just finding really concrete is what if we got a group of investors to say, we want to include social threat modeling in how we look at our investments, right? They could collaboratively invest in figuring out how to do that social threat modeling because they would care about the unintended consequences. And just coming back, Vicki, to a couple conversations we've been in, hopefully you're in conversations that I'm not in as well. I realize there's a lot of these, but the kind of last couple conversations, it's tangible, right? Like if we design social threat modeling around gender-based violence for fintech and adjacently to that, surveillance technology, if we designed that, we could say, this is what we're asking for. And we could say to DFAT and USAID and other big investors who are trying to do good, run your technologies that you invest into, mandate that they go through this. It's so tangible.
I was just going to comment on something and then maybe raise one of the questions that I had. I feel, and there's a way as well to frame that in a very positive, not everything has to be obviously positive, but you can frame it in such a positive way in terms of preventative, sustainability, like looking at sustainability of this product, recognizing that if you don't do this, you're actually, baking it, not looking at the potential, risks and downside of it. And so therefore it comes back to that whole framing of, well, this is just good due diligence of any kind of, product or service. And I mean, Vicki's raised one of the examples of the types of things that would be you would look for in a social threat modeling. But I guess it'd be interesting to know from others, like, I mean, we're not going to have the whole list, but like what would be either the lenses or the particular examples of things that would be included in that social threat modeling? Like what would that look like? I guess just a question to the group.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a good amount of research around financial abuse and domestic violence in particular, right? Just the level of financial abuse, and then naming financial abuse as a form of violence in and of itself, because part of the just thinking, there is so much connection between violence and financial security and who controls your finances. And Sierra, you could probably say this better than me. How about I shut up and you talk? If you don't want to.
I was going to say, that sounds perfect. You're on the right track, Phil. That's perfect.
I was just going to, oh, sorry, John.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that in the Sydney Morning Herald last weekend, and I think The Age in Melbourne as well, that CBA, so the Commonwealth Bank being the largest retail bank in Australia, actually had a cover page which was purely black, and basically, you know, highlighted the epidemic in Australia of domestic violence, and inside that had some situations such as you know, the financial abuse that happens in like bold sort of white on black lettering, which was really like in your face. I don't know if you saw it, Rosanna, but for that to be in the national newspaper, it was sort of really bringing it forward that this is something that we're going to address, which I thought was good.
Yeah, no, they've done a lot of work on this. I mean, I think, again, I'm going to bring the male angle, and it's part of like the social threat modeling is not just focusing on women, but what's also a solution. And one of the things we've been working with our members on is a paper that we put out recently on employees who use domestic and family violence and how workplaces respond to those people. So I mean perpetrators, but using specifically the word employees who use domestic and family violence. And I think, you know, like, it's really interesting. Sometimes, I'm not saying, you know, this for everyone, but like people just aren't aware what that some behavior that they might be demonstrating or others might be demonstrating is actually violence, is actually abuse. And I think, you know, that could be another example of, is what you're going to do proactively taking a stance to reduce gender-based violence? Because as we said, if you're just neutral, you're not for, right? So if your product or service doesn't actually proactively do something to resolve these issues, then you're not neutral, you're against, right? So again, your product is part of the problem. And so I think, again, like, I think any of these examples have to include something that says about changing the mindsets and behaviors of men, and not just about safeguarding women. Obviously it has to be both, but I think this what's been really good, and it's probably been said for a long time, but that has become more conscious than a lot of people, and probably white people around, you know, if you're not actively supporting a cause, then you're against it. You're not doing anything. So I think in this social threat modeling, it has to not just be what you're doing to solve, if you're just not doing any of these things, which I think particularly around changing mindsets and behaviors of men, then you're part of the problem.
Huh. What's that phrase, employees that use domestic or?
Yeah, employees who use domestic and family violence. There was a lot of conversation whether to use the word perpetrator or not. And workplace responses to that. What's your responsibility? Started sort of like 5-10 years ago with work on domestic and family violence as a workplace issue with our members, and we've slowly got to, okay, well, what do you do about perpetrators? Obviously victim-centric and all of that, but
Yeah, but it's, we didn't ask for this, so somebody else figured out how to do it. Kalia, are we taking your idea and running too far with it? Or are you figuring out how we should?
Well, I would say like the idea is me and Shireen Mitchell, and I think no, I think it's fine. I think it's a good, we've been trying to raise money to do social threat modeling around the decentralized identity technologies, which are right next door to fintech. And we've so far found zero interest by the powers that be within our industry. So it would be great if you guys picked it up, and then maybe we could bring it back over to the industry island. I think it's, and I think if you wanted to have a conversation with Shireen, she'd be really open to it. And
cool. Well, I also just dropping in this article that when I looked for social threat modeling, Shireen showed right up there of like, because I think there's also, so she's been working on Stop Online Violence Against Women. Is that her organization?
Yeah, that's her org, and I put a link to
the collaboration that you two have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just think there's something about it of, I mean, I don't want to.
But you put a link where?
Just in the chat. Oh, sorry. I mean, I put it only to Carolyn because you wanted that, Carolyn. There you go. That's the chat.
I'm checking it out, but I think everybody should get in on this. It's a really interesting article.
Yeah, and so the proposal that we wrote, like Shireen and I wrote, John was the other potential co-author for the proposal that we've been working on. So yeah, we know John. So
how broad is this? Is this like lots of people talking about social threat modeling, or like the three of you?
It's like, I mean, well, in this article, he lists several other things. I mean, there's folks like Sept Harry, who was at the Coral Project. There's a small group of us who've been sort of floating it and wondering about it for this next generation of social web tools that are going to be built. All the new stuff, which is mostly being driven by young white men without thinking about the implications of the design choices of the social space that make it dangerous for whole groups of people. But it's fine for them because they're not facing harassment on a large scale on the internet because they're doing it.
Well, and I think there's also a growing interest, a bunch of investors to look at, in general, the move of money towards the digital world overall and the general implications of that, particularly post-COVID.
So I would say like pick it up, run with it, but like reference back and include the people who named it. And I think it may be called something. It's more like, financial threat modeling if you're in fintech, and like what are the risks that vulnerable people, what are those risks? You're never going to stop them completely, but have you even thought through use cases of, account takeover, sharing a phone, we could go down a bunch of stuff.
Right, but that's part of the, why not broaden it beyond, we're just talking about fintech because we're in this conversation and the title of the conversation was fintech. What if we looked overall at, because again, what people say when they're investing in tech is tell me how I can figure out if we name this as a process metric that says, have you done a social threat modeling alongside, this other threat modeling and say, let's mandate that.
So I would say that part of it is that the what isn't there is there isn't like a place you could go and be like, here's a threat modeling framework. That framework hasn't been built because we've just been talking it. We could have
it has been built. The social threat modeling hasn't been built.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We would need
somebody to go build it. Let's get you to go build it, but let's get a bunch of people demanding it and paying for it.
Yeah. That would be great.
Let's do that. That feels actionable.
Yeah.
That's my takeaway. Anybody have other takeaways from this conversation? I'm sorry, I'm going to go do that. But it seems really I don't know. See, does this resonate with you? You're sitting on the ground with folks. Stuff shows up. Does stuff show up in your world that's wow, that doesn't work for the folks I work with? Or is this seem distant from you.
Sort of, but a lot of this is like completely new information to me as well. So I'm still kind of processing it.
Right, but I think part of the question is also how do we make sure, and this is what I know Kalia and others around you do, is like how do we actually make sure that the people who are working on forms of domestic violence, like who are working on the ground with survivors, are actually part of the process, because that's the,
So,
how do we, yeah.
So there's I would also go talk to Annie Cannons. I did point them this direction of the conference. They're not here though, at least not that I know of. Maybe someone is here, but they train survivors of human trafficking and domestic abuse to become computer programmers, and then they have a for-profit side that gets contract work. And then they've also recently got a grant to build apps for domestic, people trying to navigate the shelter and the help system to help people leave and get into a better place. They're having survivors build apps for navigating that system, which isn't the same as fintech, but they're like tech. They are tech people who are survivors who may have really good input into what they need, what is dangerous. And when I've been talking to them, the sort of threats they're trying to mitigate when building are really unique. I don't want to speak for them, but.
What's the name of the organization?
Annie Cannons, ANNIECONNONS.
All right. More things to check out. All right. Well, we don't have to go for an hour and a half if we don't want to. This feels like a little denouement, right? Of like we built up, there was an insight. That's all I asked for in a conversation is one new idea. I mean, it's not all about me, but I got what I needed. No, just kidding. any reflections on this conversation, and then we'll call
I just love this, Joy, how you were like, right, okay, let's cut this off because I'm going to go start working on this.
Let's move to action. Come on. That's cool.
I don't know why, just like at the end, I was just getting very excited. I was just, I'd be very keen to kind of hear more about what comes out of this. And also, I have to work with all our different program directors at MailChimp as a change and kind of think about this more broadly. But I just keep thinking, like, what am I going to put in front of our CEOs and how are we going to have these conversations in our group? So I don't know, you may not be familiar with what I do, but we convene these groups of male CEOs who want to prioritize and take action on gender equality. And they're a varied group of CEOs. In the group that I look after in Australia, it's, everything from sort of $100 billion organizations, huge, like sort of conglomerates, as well as investment groups. And so we're quite keen to look at investment and gender equality and really keep driving that conversation. But another group is our global technology group, and it has some people like Brent Hoberman, who founded lastminute.com in the UK, but also runs Founders Forum and so forth, as well as some other entrepreneurs like WeTransfer and a few others, and like Microsoft Ventures and so forth. So I'm just like, what can we think about building into? They meet in person now, and have these conversations about what we call action areas. And I'm just wondering, I'll have to work with our program director, but what on this in particular, what can we put in front of them so that they can start to have more of these conversations with their peers? So I guess that's just a request as well as an invitation.
Yeah, no.
You're thinking about getting in ears of people that then will have further conversations at that sort of CEO level. I'm really keen to keep pushing this.
Yeah, and I was also just thinking, so I was thinking about an Australian philanthropist, her name is escaping my mind, who works in data. And this actually would be fascinating about this idea. Anyway, but I also think, Rosanna, let's make sure towards the end of the conference, either with your relationship manager or with me, just kind of going through across 30 conversations, how do we sort of pull out some actionable elements? But this one feels sort of tangible. Any other thoughts? I'm getting away from what do you put in front of people? Any other thoughts on sort of reflecting on this conversation?
Yeah, I think, you know, for our work in public markets, this doesn't feel like the step that we can use yet, but I'm excited about it because it does feel like what leads to the steps that we will eventually be able to use. What we've seen in some other areas is the work had to be done first in the private investing space.
Yep.
To build out the framework and see what kind of questions you could ask, which you can then kind of abstract, because we then have to be able to rely on sort of metrics that you can measure across companies because we're doing passive investing, right? That you aren't necessarily going to be able to go in and sit down with a company and ask them to take apart their process and answer questions. And if they don't do it, they're out of luck and they don't get the money, right? But the frameworks that are developed here become the basis that helps us think about what to go look for, what to start pushing for, what kind of transparency to start pushing for. So it's a longer haul process. But this feels like the groundwork that's needed in order to get to the place where that becomes possible.
Yeah, no. And that kind of, I mean, where part of my thinking about this in the sort of the food chain of influence is where the site of innovation is happening. How are we influencing what people think is innovative? And while that's not the only place that I want to play, it is a site of influence.
Yeah.
And hence I haven't totally given up on accelerators, but haven't been near one for a long time. I get hives sometimes. So I'm sure you do as well. Right after how many years were you at Agora?
Enough.
Enough. Any takeaways for you, Sierra?
I think my main takeaway is just financial technology overall. And I just keep thinking about how we can actually use that for survivors, especially how we can connect it to microloans and things like that for them. And so that's something I do want to talk to like my team about, just to see like if they can have any ideas around that and things like that. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I would definitely, I mean, one of my favorites is just quickly trying to find the, is this organization C-Note. And it's less, Kat Berman is a great friend, and I think just creating some cool stuff. I don't know why she's not here. I forgot to, anyway, that's C-Note. And it's just a good example of somebody who's very aware of gender-based violence domestically and looking at financial technologies, similar to the folks at Good Shepherd in Australia.
I'll second the plug for C-Note. They really are terrific.
Yeah, Kat's amazing. Vicki, any takeaways from you?
I'm with you, Joy. I'm just getting excited about the social threat modelling. So I can't see anything else. No, it was good.
Been blinded by the Kalia light.
Yeah. I love the process of just that whole, the three people chiming in and the little lights coming on, and now I understand convergence. So you're taking me 3 sessions.
This is the like, nobody really wants to talk about fintech. The tech person doesn't really think it's a big trend. We're talking about a range of different things. Why are we on this call together? Is this going to go anywhere? Weren't you all thinking that? Anyway,
I'm a little bit, I mean, there's a flag that comes up, which for me, which is like, I heard people talk about blockchains, and I have grave concerns about crypto generally, and, future scenario, like understanding, crypto is not going away, but what do future directions it's going or trends it's going mean for this issue of gender-based violence? Not clear at all, and nobody is nobody's talking about it, but I think it feels like a topic to maybe convene some people who could have good opinions about it. I mean, it's hard enough to understand finance. I don't know if any of your finance thingies talked about how Bitcoin works or Ethereum or, unstoppable smart contracts that execute on their own. Like, oh, was that good thing for women in society?
Right. No, and I think part of it is I mean, I barely know how to spell blockchain, and I think it's I will say some folks have approached us saying, here is a way that you could shift power dynamics in blockchain. I agree with you, Clea. I think it's something that needs to keep being looked at. But I think why, I don't know why I don't have those same red flags around this idea is I think we're talking about, while there might be blockchain underlying some of these financial technologies, many of them are simply what's the security, which comes back to what the blockchain technology is. But can I still like the social threat idea? Because wouldn't we get to whether or not there are ramifications by doing this magical threat analysis that you're going to design?
So there's another question about, because the architecture of money in Bitcoin is so different, and a lot of it, the reason it was fueling drug markets is because it was like, quote unquote, anonymous. Okay, like anonymous money is both good and bad. And like, there's a set of things that are very blockchain specific that are systemic things, which is different than what we're talking about, which is like fintech apps.
Yep. Okay. Worth noting the sort of deeper infrastructure that some of these things are skirting over the surface of is also worth looking at.
Mm-hmm. And
I'll take the win today, though, and go deeper later. Sorry, Vicky, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think Clea makes a really good point in that, and a bit like finance, where knowledge of finance is power, and that's what you've uncovered, Joy. And I think that needs to extend to the new world around blockchain and crypto, because if we exclude that, then without having that knowledge or understanding it so that those red flags come up to people that are actually looking for them, because if you don't have a framework in place, it's not being looked at all. It will grow its own legs and it will run away, and we'll have to do catch up like we're doing with finance now.
Mm-hmm. Well, so and that's why I would love to take this conversation to Kath Leong, who is here and knows a crap of, like, Kath, right, Vicky?
Kath is who introduced me to you. So love Kath.
Oh, got it, gotcha. But I think Kath is actually, she just might not be up at 7. Oh, she has kids. So 7 o'clock is probably not a great time for her. But let's follow up and talk to her, because I think there's a lot of thinking in terms of the company she's at right now, and I'd be curious what some of her thoughts on this are.
There's another amazing woman that we worked with at NAB that is basically running the blockchain conversation there, and we collaborated together, the 3 of us at NAB, so that could also be a really good introduction point too.
And also the clever woman at Good Shepherd.
Yeah.
What's her name?
Are you thinking about Corinne?
I'm talking about Corinne. I was trying to think of the woman who I went gin tasting with, which isn't a helpful reference for you. One time I went to Australia and got to leave a city as Corinne took me out and took me gin tasting. So gotta say.
Did you have chicken parma as well?
These are the things I love about Australia.
I think Corinne's left Good Shepherd actually, but we can join those dots.
All good. All those connected people who came out of that National Australia Bank is NAB, for those of you who are not Australian.
I have one thought that, Dora, you were saying, how am I going to translate this into my work? I predominantly future public companies. They're not quite there, and they're thinking on gender issues. And I'm reflecting back on our conversation earlier this morning about supply chain and financing GBV, breakthroughs in certain sectors. And I think the idea of the lead firm approach is really important, because it's going to take a couple of early adopters to start implementing this social methodology in their investment practices. It's going to take a couple of early adopters who are going to participate in that, because I'm sure there's going to be pushback from firms that say too time consuming, too expensive, not core to our business model, blah, blah. So this is the power of, finding those early people that can step up to the plate per se, and embrace this for the betterment of society, really. Because until we get the data to support, why certain things are good for society overall, versus things that have unintended consequences, and we end up funneling, adverse implications, we won't have anything to base our investment analysis off of. We're all speculating here. Yeah. And I think the data is really what's going to ground this.
The comment I was going to make is sort of opposite to that, and that while it's not fintech, there's a great opportunity for a bank, an established bank, to sort of be the first mover on this as well. And because also they're the ones investing in fintechs too. So Valiant's part-owned, I think, by Westpac, I think have put some money in. And so these big banks are the ones also driving the new wave of how these fintechs are going to be working. And so wouldn't it be interesting if they were like, we're going to start driving this process of social impact analysis on our new products and services in anything we invest in.
Mm-hmm. Especially if it's a big bank, like there's a huge reputational risk then. Nobody wants to be associated with negative implications. So if the general population was informed and aware, they could be demanding that from their banking institution.
Mm-hmm. And we've had a huge royal commission into banking recently. Yeah. So it's
Well, I'm also thinking there's a wide network that's global, but many of the banks are US, of sort of banks that were started to be explicitly socially responsible. You don't have any of those in Australia, do you? Sort of the, anyway, there's a whole sort of range of, there was just a women's bank launched out of Chicago, like thinking about different platforms out of banking. Lots of banking innovation, but in social responsible investing these days. But
yeah, some neobanks, but not like the big ones.
Yeah. Well, wasn't this fun? Interesting place to land. And I do think it's really important. And I think as all of us take this conversation out and sort of talk about the social threat modeling, I do also want to reinforce, well, I think Kalia, you made this point very gently, but I'd like to make it louder to also say this is authorship from like outside of this. So sort of being able to reference back where these ideas came from becomes important as we travel, because this is some pretty important intellectual property that you're working on, Kalia. And so I just want to name that and honor it and make sure that it is respected.
Yep.
No, that is hard in your world. So,
yeah.
Okay. That's an understatement.
Oh my God, my world.
Yeah. You are fighting the valiant front as like the sort of in the worlds that I can't even describe, that you've been holding.
You can come to our conference, Joy. Our big conference is coming up October 20th to 22nd, and it's super fantastic.
Send me an invite. I will figure out how we can be there. All right. So, well, with that, I think we can move things on with our days or evenings, and hopefully your kids calm down at some point. Dora, are they properly under control?
He's probably playing video games. I think he was mad because my husband told him he had to do homework.
Gotcha. All right. Well, take care, everybody, and see you at the next conversation.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.